once the substrates are actually dry, this is the point that we finally get to. So I'll show you the one where I was just basically cleaning my palettes, ended up like this. And that could be fine as a background for something, or something that might want to work over. Some of these bits are still slightly tacky, so personally I'm going to leave this one for now, but this is just an example of how you can recycle just using the paints that you've got in your palette to either create an abstract piece or something that you can then add collage to or work over the top of and create more layers. So these are the other two pieces, the main pieces that I was working on, and this is them in their dried state. So now, as you can see from the chaos of the table, it's time to think about some collage elements. So if you're not a fan of cutting out fiddly things, you might want to just work with sort of odd scraps of paper and just kind of place them in an abstract way to sort of almost create more colour, more dynamism to your piece. You might want something quite textural like this, an offcut of something from around the house, and you might want to just kind of place it in a particular way. So for example, kind of offcuts you can sort of place like so, and you know, work with colour. So you don't put pink against pink, put it against green. And here we can also consult the trusty colour wheel, because we know that kind of pinks and purples and greens sit opposite each other on the colour wheel, so we can create some nice contrast, colour contrast. You might want to cut things out like this. I've got some quite surreal ones here. These are from previous projects, and I often find when I collage I spend a lot of time cutting things and then I'll place them, for example, somewhere and just think that really doesn't work. You know, so for example, you could do something that was quite surreal, like, and I have done this myself before, where you're almost putting random elements into things, and you can cut them off as well. They don't have to kind of appear neat and tidy. It's a bit like, if you're of a certain age and generation like myself, you will understand what fuzzy felt is. It's a bit like placing pieces on a fuzzy felt board, because at this stage, when nothing's glued down, you can pretty much play however you want to. So there's all kinds of things that you can put and place and change around, and you might find that, you know, within a composition you want to play with placement and look at balance and look at repetition, or take out elements or put elements in elsewhere, and those are all perfectly valid things to do. So these are primarily magazine images. Sometimes I use my own photos, so that's one of my own photos. I'll use the collage papers that I spoke about in the previous video, or I'll just cut random things out like this. You may also want to look at magazines and do something which is word-based. So this obviously isn't cut out properly, it's just roughly cut and kept for a future project. You might want to do something which is kind of based on your emotions, or something where you freehand over the top, or you write in quite a scrawly way that someone can't understand, and then you put random words from magazines in. There's all kinds of possibilities. You might want to create collage elements yourself. So this is something I created with spray ink and stamps and a music notation book. So, you know, you might want to place something like that onto your work and create it yourself. You might want to get a pre-printed collage sheet. So this just has all kinds of things which you can then cut around yourself. And in terms of sort of cutting around objects, it can be quite fiddly. So for example, I have one here which is a lotus flower. So you'll need a good pair of scissors, and if you've got a small image, then I would suggest small sharp scissors, or alternatively you could use a cutting mat and a craft knife. So you want to get nice clean edges. So this is against a dark background. So what I don't want is a black line when I place my image onto my substrate. What I want to achieve, you can see here, is without that black line around it. So I almost need to cut slightly inside of the object that I'm working with. And you might be someone who loves cutting, you might be somebody who hates cutting, but I'm probably a converted cutter. When I first started with collage, I used to find it quite a pain, and it was kind of a necessary evil to get to the end result. So I knew what I wanted to create, or I was in the process of creating intuitively, and kind of knew what I liked the look of as I went along. But the actual cutting part didn't really do it for me. And I still have days like that occasionally, where I think I don't really have the patience for cutting. But then there are other days where it's just really relaxing. And so I would give it a chance, and I would try both methods. I would try with the scissors, and as I say, make sure they've got a fairly decent blade. I mean, these are my everyday kind of crafting scissors. I mean, I get paint out of the end of tubes with this, so they're not exactly sacred, but they are still quite sharp because they're not that old. They're only a few years old. They haven't been hanging around for years and years. Alternatively, as I say, you might want to get cutting mat, which you can get very cheaply from craft shops, or if you're in the UK, places like The Works sell them as well. And then a craft knife, but I would say be very careful if you're using a craft knife, because obviously it's a very sharp blade. And many years ago, having cut myself with one right across my finger, it's very painful and it bleeds a lot. So please be careful if you're working with a sharp, unguarded blade. Sounds obvious, but it's so easy to just slip up and then really hurt yourself. And then your finger is out of action creatively for weeks after that, because everything you do is very sore, a bit like a paper cut, but 10 times worse. So you have been warned that craft knives are lethal weapons. Always cut away from yourself as well. So if you're using a craft knife, always cut away from your fingers or your hand. So I won't demonstrate today how to cut with a craft knife, because we're all grown-ups, and I think you can probably figure out how to do that yourself. So there we go. Now it's got underleaves here. I don't know whether you can see, and they're almost shadowed. So they're not part of the background, but they're not part of the foreground, but they don't look quite right when I cut them. So I'm going to take those out, and it's something you have to judge by eye, because photographs are taken in particular light settings. You will often find that there are things which aren't background or foreground. They're kind of part of the image, but sometimes for a collage they don't work. This would probably look neater without this part here as well, so I'm going to take that out and cut around it. So as long as it doesn't make your image look strange or unrecognisable as the object it actually is, then I would suggest you go that route. And I've also got another leaf here which I'm going to take out. So there you go. I'll just do that, and I've got some of my edge here I can see, so let's take that out too. There we go. So say for example I wanted to place that in my image, and I quite often use lotus flowers in my own artwork, and they are rather lovely. So I can do that. I was also mentioning in another video craft punch. So here's a piece of paper, here's the craft punch. I'll just place it. You can see more clearly if you place it on this side, because it will show you what you're actually cutting. And then you have a perfect little circle. So you might want something like that. And here's one I made earlier. I have several I made earlier. They're scattered around the table currently. I'm sure they'll pop up as I sift through the piles of things. You can also do it on quite flimsy paper as well. I've used a previous craft punch to create something here, and it will still cut even though it's quite flimsy paper. Or you might want to take one of your paper bags and use a craft punch to cut around. You can also create recognisable shapes. So this is a bird, obviously, which is made out of patterned paper, and that's another technique that I use. I would encourage you to find your own techniques and things that suit you, because as much as we have an artistic style, we also have a collage style. So I know that mine is kind of favoured nature and bright colours and diagonals I use a lot. There's all sorts of things which almost become your motifs. So it's for you to play with what it is that you want to create. I often do things which are quite surreal as well, but that's my style. So you need to find your style and your way with this. You might want to collage things that you find around the house. You might want to paint on old bits of envelope and use those. You might want to take some lovely paper like this and then cut it and place it along a border just to create something which is different. It's entirely up to you. You might want to be a maximalist collager and use lots and lots of different things, or you might want to be a minimalist collager and use just very, very minimal elements, and that's entirely your choice because it's your composition and it's how you want it to look. Sometimes people create something which looks like a background and then they become stumped because they almost don't want to mess it up. But the joy of collage, I'm just going to cut another one of these while I'm talking to you. The joy of collage is that you can always play with the placement before you commit. I personally find it's quite interesting to be quite intuitive about how I place things and not really think about it, just kind of like take random elements and then sort of place them on, and you know, if I like the way it looks then I just commit and I glue. So you might be someone who doesn't want to make the decision and doesn't want to glue, and you know, you're sort of more hesitant, and it is something that comes with practice, and it's something that's very interesting to work with because it makes us think of the overall composition and of object placement as well. So if you're not very confident cutting, something like a craft punch might suit you to start working with, because it's making those cuts for you. So it's making the perfect circle, and circles are something that are very tricky to actually get right because it's so easy to make a very, very wonky circle, believe it or not. So say for example you wanted to play with a recurring motif in your work and you wanted to be cautious and use something like a craft punch, or maybe, I don't know, you wanted to play with geometric shapes. I've done that before with different works, so you might want to cut out squares or triangles or whatever it is you want to work with, and then create those objects and then place them around. So geometric shapes is quite a nice one to start with. You see some shapes just sit in here and don't want to come out. Geometric collage is a nice one to start with because it's very, very simple shapes and it gets you used to playing with composition. So I'm just going to carry on doing this. Some papers are too thin, so this paper for example, it's actually jammed the punch, so then you have to try and release it. It's really jammed the punch. I think that's something I might have to come back to off camera because it's been quite stubborn. So yeah, if you're using quite thin paper like this, it does have the tendency to try and jam things. You almost want something that's stiffer like this, because that way the paper will hold its shape and it won't sort of get stuck into the punch. You might want to use sort of really bold things like the stripy bags. You might want to just tear them or cut them into shapes. You might have other ideas. I mean, if you actually research the genre of collage, there are lots and lots of collage artists, past and present,